everybody's happy. That's why there's not that many people here. Yeah, but we have enough for one.
Well,
Right?
I told you that's a really matters.
Yeah,
I'm saying
we're all voting members.
Going for what?
Okay, we will go ahead and get started. It is 1:03 p.m. today, and I guess I'll knock this up to let you know we're all beginning. Welcome to everybody. We will go ahead and start with our call to order. I'll go ahead and mention the names of the people. Please tell me if you are here. Eddie Teasdale.
Present.
Wade Major.
Present.
Don Quist.
Here.
Don Decker.
Present.
Earl Wilson.
Present.
Myself, Adam Bingham, here. And then Mallory Boyd. Okay, and I have been notified that Tim Parker, Stephen Bork, and Michelle Anderson will all not be available today. But it looks like we still have a quorum. Okay, item number 2. This is open, of course, for our public comments. This time is reserved for the public to address the committee about matters not on the agenda. No action will be taken on non-agenda items unless authorized by law. Comments are limited to 3 minutes per person, and I invite all of you up to the podium.
Yes, Larry Mead. I was wondering is your group looking at any of the water levels and planning to do any work south of Inyokern down by Robert's Roost?
That's a good question. Do we have anybody here that has some answers on that?
What do you mean, do something?
An exploration well, aquifer test,
Yes.
quantities.
Oh, you mean work?
Work, yeah, work.
There
Sorry,
are-
Steve. The work part, where you actually go out and get in the work.
There
Steve,
are-
do you want to answer that on the TSS portion?
Well, the final well hasn't been selected yet.
You need your microphone.
Are we on? It's on.
And possibly a bit closer to it.
We have the TSS work that you know about, so we're still trying to identify the appropriate well for the TSS work, the new well that we're going to put in. There may be more than one, but at least one the first year. That's been pushed back a little bit. We also are working on aqua performance test locations right now. I'm not sure, maybe if Heather knows, maybe we could comment where exactly those are. Where that's
Well, maybe the Hart's Place well that's actually coming up in water level.
Mm-hmm.
Have we taken any of that in consideration?
Steve, I can answer that.
Sure.
The El Paso Basin is substantially hydraulically isolated from the main basin by the El Paso Fault. There's about a 300-foot elevation difference, and there's very little water being extracted from that basin at present time. And so whatever recharge there is from Horse and Cowhaven and the other canyons, whatever recharge there is will essentially remain in that basin except for minor leakage across the El Paso Fault.
So you've actually done aquifer testing there, Don?
No. Their Bureau Rec Well 1 is in that basin, and we're fully aware of the increases and decreases in water level that that basin experiences. And that data goes back, as far as the Bureau Rec Well, goes back to the early 90s. So we've got 30 plus years of data from that well, which includes the deeper portion of the basin as well as the shallower portion. It's a very thorough evaluation. As far as a pump test, no.
Do you have any explanation why the water level down there is 200 foot, the static water level, and the elevation is 600 feet higher than the southwest well field?
Yes, I just told you. That basin is substantially isolated hydraulically from the main Indian Wells Basin by the El Paso Fault.
Without testing it, though? Without actually going down there and exploring?
We have wells that have actually penetrated into the fault zone and have discovered intermediate levels. The fault has been mapped geologically back to 1960.
Well, I'm talking about a current production test to see what the potential is there.
No.
Thank you. Is that a consideration?
Yes, that's what Mr. Johnson just talked about. There is an effort that would be funded by the state for some number of wells, and we have tried to tailor a well project that would fit within that budget. And it's ongoing. That effort is ongoing. We're not totally settled out.
But we're making decisions to send stuff to DWR before we actually get the data down there.
That is a minor part of our overall picture.
A minor part. Okay, thank you.
If you have any responses to that, Stetson, go ahead, please come now.
Yeah, Nicole?
Nicole, thank you.
I'll just, since we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Pardon?
I have a response.
I know. I was going to make. I didn't sure I introduce you. I normally bring Jeff Helsley with me, and I've told a couple of people already. Jeff wasn't feeling well Monday, and yesterday morning he had his appendix out, so he's still in recovery. So he's. We hope that he'll be out and be back to work next week, but he's not here. We brought Nicole. Nicole works directly with G. Moran and Steve Reich out of the Carlsbad office, and Heather, a really, really good replacement for Jeff. We got Heather here and myself. So. Nicole, you wanted to respond to it?
Yeah, so you had talked to Jean about 2 weeks ago, maybe. So I have groundwater levels to show you afterwards. Okay, but you might have access. I wanted to talk to you about access to a well, the Armistead well.
I guess my big concern is when we talk to Gene Moran.
We need you to come back up to the podium and speak into the microphone for recording as well. Pardon?
My problem is, we talked to Gene Moran. She told Elaine and I.
This is a public setup, though. Sorry to interrupt. I need you to come on up here.
Okay.
Thank you. No, come on up, please. We just want to be aware of your concerns.
Talk to us after.
And
No, I'm not talking to Steve off the record. I'm done talking off the record.
Okay.
This is public now.
Okay. Well, let me do one little bit of a response to try to maybe help a little bit. The work that we need to do to get the GSP done, we're out of time on that. We've got to get the GSP done and written and out for you guys to review based on what we already know. We had never planned on doing this type of field work as part of developing the GSP. It is in the GSP going forward, and it is in the Prop 1 grant going forward, but it's planned on being done after the first of the year. Now, we've talked before about having an annual report for the GSP and a 5-year update. So that data is not going to be lost. It's not going to be something that we're not going to consider going forward. But the information that we have for the GSP now is the information we have, and that's what we're going forward with. So I don't know if that helps, but at least we never did at any time plan on doing the aquifer performance test or drilling any wells from the time we got started to get this GSP prepared. That was never actually planned. The TSS, we took a shot at, and as we worked through the state on the TSS, which is really not grant funding, it's services, never panned out in a schedule that we could get something done as part of the GSP.
but that
But
is
you're
on
making
hold.
decisions. You're making decisions on allotments for the future.
That's correct.
And when we talked to Jean, I was very amazed when she said that there could be good data down there. So we could take from what's down there and we can average it into the rest of the valley to make the other part of the valley not look so bad. Is that really a good way to do business?
It's the best information we have right now without doing going out and doing more field work, which preferred, yeah, we should. It would be nice to
But
be able
look
to
at the
do
money that's been spent and the time that's been spent, and you're getting ready to send this to DWR. And you're getting ready to make decisions on allotments.
Yeah.
And we don't,
Keep in mind, Larry, the money we're spending now is mostly.
I'm not talking about the money.
Well, you said the money is being spent, and the money that's being spent
We're not
is mostly DWR money for planning, not for field work. It's for planning the GSP. There's no money available.
And don't you think that that making a plan is part of getting the data and testing the aquifer to see what we have?
If we could do it, I would absolutely be recommending to do that, yes. If we had the money and the resources and the time to do it, we would be recommending.
So let me ask you a hypothetical. If someone was willing to go down there and drill a well, would the GA be behind supporting that?
The Water Resources Manager would, yes. And would like to be involved, to understand what we're going after, what information we're going after, for sure, yes.
And you'll sell that to the GA?
I will try. I don't actually run the GA, but I will try.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
I have a
Thank
quick
you, both
question.
of you.
Can I ask a
Yeah,
quick
go
question?
ahead.
Don't put Larry on the spot. Larry, I hate to make you walk away back, so I won't. So is your thought, Larry, that maybe this sort of forced allocation concept, it's being pushed too hard now, and we need to collect some additional data and then maybe reevaluate this in 5 years, given the time frame that Steve has to develop this GSP? I mean,
believe, Eddie, we have to test the aquifer to see how it's talking to us. And without that information, I don't know how we can set allocation.
right. All right, thanks.
I'll add a little bit more here. The Indian Wells Valley Basin is one of the most extensively studied basins on the face of the earth, literally, and it has been going on for almost 100 years, and the impetus for much of it has been the presence of the Navy and the issue of groundwater supply. As far as the El Paso Basin, which is where you're talking about, the evidence there is that the recharge is relatively low because the groundwater levels, when they do rise with spring flows, is quite modest. But then overall, there's no permanent increase. So the water levels are relatively stable. The wells that have been drilled through very obdurate sediment. That means cemented and not very high yield sediments. There no doubt are places where that's not so, but it appears to be a relatively shallow basin with not a whole lot of opportunity for much water to be in storage. There have been extensive seismic studies done there, as there has been in the rest of the basin. What I just summarized is why I said that it's a relatively minor part of our overall water budget. And it's not that we're ignoring it, it's just that as we've said over and over, time is short, and the plan as it stands is very well grounded. It's not just a shot in the dark at all.
Thank you for your comments, everyone. Do we have any other comments from members of the public? Okay. We will go ahead and move on to item number 3, the WRM Stetson's discussion on the draft GSP sections and their work in progress. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Adam. And the first item we've got is basin setting data gap status report, and Nicole's going to do that, so she'll come up and get us started. Primarily talking about the TDS sampling plan and the water quality sampling that we have done and are planning to do going forward. I want to say one other thing, just in case Jeff is watching, to say hi to Jeff, because he might be in the hospital room watching us, but maybe not.
So I'm going to talk about the water quality and stable isotope sampling analysis for Prop 1. So we have the objectives of establishing a baseline for water quality and measuring the changes over time, filling existing data gaps, refining the existing monitoring network, validating the hydrogeologic conceptual model, and updating the mod flow model. So for the water quality and stable isotope analyses, we're planning on focusing on TDS, general chemistry, and isotope analysis. So the general chemistry analyses that we're planning on doing is on the right hand of the screen, or if you have the handout, it's in the right hand of your PowerPoint slide. So we are going to take samples from 30 groundwater wells, and we're going to focus on 20 CASGEM wells and 10 domestic wells. And then we're going to do additionally 10 springs. And for those, we're going to do the TDS and general chemistry analysis. And then for the isotope analysis, we're going to do 14 sample sites, and these sample sites will overlap with the water quality sampling sites. So for the first set of sampling, we're going to be sampling domestic wells, and we're planning on doing this sometime in mid-September or early October. And we're going to try to do it on a weekend. So over 2 weekends, we're going to contact domestic well owners and coordinate with them and set up a time where we could come out and have them pump the well for us to take the sample. So if you look at the map, the red dots are domestic wells that we have permission to sample, and then the orange are dots that we're waiting on permission from the owners to sample. So the steps for the sampling that we're going to be doing is we'll coordinate with the owner, we'll purge 3 well casing volumes, and then we'll establish stabilization of some physical parameters like pH, specific conductance, dissolved oxygen, and turbidity, and then we'll collect the sample and send it to a California state certified lab for analysis. So like the domestic wells, we'll also be sampling the CASGEM wells, and this is going to be performed by a subcontractor. So the CASGEM wells that we're focusing on are the ones that are the yellow on the screen or in your handout if you have a handout. So those are the ones that Stetson is planning on sampling. The green are the CASGEM wells the Brackish Water Group is planning on sampling. And then the black, we're coordinating with the Navy to install hydrosleeves to sample that way. So for the subcontractor, for the CASGEM wells, we have it scheduled for the week of October 28th. So we're on the schedule, and we should be doing sampling sometime then. And so for the CASGEM wells, most of them are 2 inches in diameter, so we'll be having a subcontractor come out and deploying a low-flow bladder pump, and then we'll establish stabilization of parameters like we did with the domestic wells, collect a sample, and send it to a California state-certified lab for analysis. And then the last part of water quality sampling is the springs, and we plan to do this in conjunction with the domestic wells. So it's planned for sometime in mid-September, early October on weekends. And so the steps for sampling for the spring samples, we'll be collecting grab samples, so we'll just make sure that the site is has flowing water and it's not stagnant before we take the sample, and then we'll collect the sample and send it to a California state certified lab for analysis. So in summary, this last map has all of the sampling that we're planning on doing. And so for the domestic wells, it's going to be mid-September, early October, and we're going to try to do it on a weekend. The CASGEM wells is scheduled for the week of October 28th to November 1st, and the spring sampling is going to be concurrent with the domestic well sampling. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, I do have a quick question. Are you going to be able to talk with Tom Hasselbacher and the work that he has done, and in regards to the springs and the sampling up there in those 2 canyons? Grapevine and Sand?
I'm not aware of that, but I can look into it.
Are you talking about?
Okay, Gene is discussing that with him. Okay, good. Because I know sometimes this time of the year there may not be a lot of flow at all that you can see. So does that mean there is possibility that we may come back, you may come back in springtime to look to see if there's enough flow to get some good information?
Yeah, and we also have backup springs. So we're planning on sampling 10, and we have a few that we're keeping as backup.
That is good to know. Thank you.
Yep.
Tom Deck was a good one to talk to, too.
Were you talking about Tom's stream flow measurements?
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
Well, we're talking here about free-flowing streams that don't necessarily have anything to do with the main flow in the canyons.
Yes, but you also have to have situations where you can get flow data.
Absolutely.
And those two do have stuff set up there that we can get some flow data if we've had enough precipitation.
Well, there is no significant flow from any of the springs that are going to be sampled here. They're all minor flows. It's just to get additional data on
Yes.
recharge sources.
Yes, I totally understand that. Thank you.
I had a brilliant idea. I don't know if it'll, oh, go ahead, sorry. No.
I like those.
Very quick, you mentioned not all of the wells that you, private and domestic wells that you want to sample, you've got permission. What's the hurdle that has to be?
So the hurdle is, the first hurdle was getting addresses for the well owners and establishing contact mainly. But we have a couple on there that are waiting for permission, that we do have permission to sample, but a follow-up call is needed just to confirm that permission.
And likely the schedule.
Right.
We'll make sure they're going to be there and such.
Want to hear my brilliant idea now? So one thing that kind of pops out when you're talking about your water quality sampling, and I understand it's part of the grant, is, you know, and your focus on the CAS gem wells and some domestic wells, it might not hurt, and Eddie Imson's not here to kick me under the table, but it might not hurt to maybe try to coordinate some of those efforts and maybe sample some of the ag wells. And I know there's a cost to that, but maybe the ag entities would be willing to foot the bill on some of the, I mean, limited to the cost on some analysis, but that way you have, you know, a true apples to apples comparison. So, because I think what's going to happen is maybe some domestic wells, you know, you've got a sort of a water, one point in time versus some of the ag wells. I know we've been sampling our wells consistently, you know, on and off for a couple of years. But if, and we're, you know, happy to coordinate that effort and willing to probably help, you know, obviously fund the costs for some of the water quality.
And you could also get data from some of the deeper wells as opposed to perhaps the shallow to intermediate domestic wells. So if you're looking at some of the ag wells that go down to 800 or 1,000 feet, that could be some data that offers insight as well.
Do we have, I think we do, but do we have the water quality data that you folks have for the ag?
We provided some, but I just thought maybe, again, because it's sort of a...
Absolutely good to
yeah.
test more. I just want to make sure we have what you have, too. So, yeah.
KCWA does go to a couple of those wells that have been graciously provided, and they do have ongoing data that comes from it as well.
Okay.
So I know the clock's ticking, but I'm happy to have an offline conversation about, hey, how do we make this happen? Or we can sample within the same window so you have,
Right,
again,
yeah.
additional data.
Okay.
So, yeah.
One thing to keep in mind, we do have deep well information. The Bureau Rec wells that are the CAS gem wells, 2,000 feet is the deeper piezometer in those wells, except for Bureau Rec 4. So it's not that we don't have deep well data, and that deep well data is in the critical recharge zone.
I guess more current data is what I'm looking for.
Well, the CAS gem wells will be sampled as part of this effort that Stetson is talking about right now.
Yeah, it's going to be done at the same time that KCWA is coming out and getting the CASGEM wells stuff. It's all, they're all working together on this.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? And now to the public, if you have any comments or questions, come on up. Okay, is that
So you did a great job.
that portion B or A finished?
She's done.
Okay, great. Let's see, it's Nicole, yes?
Yes.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yes.
All right, item B.
This
3B.
is sustainable management criteria. Heather's going to do this. Do you want to stand up there while I do my little prelim thing? You might as well, because you're going. This is good. I can be corrected or directed. Corrected or directed. I wanted to say a couple things. I think you folks know that we, Stetson, myself, as the water resources manager, we're getting a lot of information, direction, advice in a lot of different directions. Okay, and I've done a couple of sort of random meandering talks at both the last two board meetings about where we are and where we're going, and I don't want to do that now. But there's a couple of things I've been asked to make sure that we want to make clear before Heather does the sustainable management criteria. And I understand that we do understand that there's a lot of interest and sensitivity on both sides of where we're trying to get from where we are right now on the groundwater sustainability plan. Both on the idea that we should be pumping out a lot more water before we do our cutbacks or ramping down. If there's more water down there, we should be using more of the storage. And there's a whole other group that says we should stop pumping right now because clearly we're overdrafted right now. We are having undesirable impacts right now. We've had them in the past. We've got 80-plus wells that have already been impacted. We've documented that on some of the shallow well impacts. So we got stuff on both sides about where we should be right now and where we're going. And we're frankly feeling like we're sitting somewhere kind of in the middle of this. But I wanted you folks to know we are getting pulled both directions of which a lot of interest about where things need to be. So I want to make sure that's clear. And in that regard, everybody here knows that this basin was characterized as a critically overdrafted basin by DWR. That's not a small issue. That's an important fact that this basin has been overdrafted for a long time. Most of the locals around here all know it has been. We've seen water levels drop. We've had shallow well owners give us a lot of history about impacts to their wells. So we all know that it's been overdrafted a long time. It's a critically overdrafted basin. That means something. And if you look at the big picture, when I'm talking about all the sides that are giving us a direction or pulling us in a different direction, I mean, there is a side that basically says you should stop right now, that you've already got undesirable impacts. You've already got a critical overdrafted basin. You should be able to cut back your pumping down to your approaching your sustainability levels around your 8,000, 7,500, 8,000 acre feet a year. You should be able to do that right away. That's what you should do. That's the right thing to do if you don't want to continue undesirable impacts. I want you to know that is out there. The reality is that there are a lot of interest in this basin that just doesn't allow that. It doesn't make sense to do that. So the plan we're putting together is trying to find, as I pointed out, a place in between that is going to allow some continuing undesirable impacts. It's going to happen because we've already had them, and we're going to still pump more than the replenishment supply we've got. It's going to happen. We're going to deal with that. It's going to be there, and we're going to monitor it as part of the plan. There are folks looking at as you look at the Sigma requirements under a GSP and some of the stuff we're going to present today, that it can be easily misinterpreted in that by allowing some additional removal of basin storage, some of our what we call, it's been characterized, I think fairly accurately, as your reserve water supply. Unless we get additional water from someplace, and we're working on that, unless we get a supplemental water supply, this is your reserve water supply. So there are folks out there that say, you shouldn't be taking any more of that reserve water supply. We're trying to come up with a way to make the community, allow the community to continue to operate while we do take some of that reserve water supply out of storage and develop a sustainability plan around what has been characterized as a soft landing. We're trying to get a soft landing that is reasonable for the folks involved here. That's what we're trying to accomplish. When we talk about undesirable impacts, undesirable effects, okay, we need to keep it clear that there are undesirable impacts that are going to be described today that are, I want to characterize it properly without going too far one way or the other. Characterized as academic parameters or undesirable impacts. They're required by Sigma. We have to develop a plan. We have to submit something that shows how we're going to get there, and we have to characterize our undesirable impacts around that so that that makes the assumption that the impacts that you're going to have in implementing that plan are not undesirable. Well, reality is, and DWR may argue with us about it, but the reality is we're going to have undesirable impacts even within the parameters that we're setting here. That's the impacts to the wells. We're going to have wells that are going to be impacted. We're going to have we have water quality, we have water level. We're going to have impacts that we're going to have to monitor and keep track of and address. So I wanted to make it clear that we don't have, the reason why we're trying to do it this way is because we don't have a clear path toward a supplemental water supply. We don't have a real clear, we have a general idea. We don't have a clear idea of what the Navy is going to do. The Navy has established itself. It's on record as saying that groundwater is the biggest issue that they have. It's the biggest issue that base has going forward is their groundwater supply. And we've gotten a lot of information about what they might think their reserve rights might be, which would take precedent of almost everybody in the basin. Okay? So we've gotten that indication. We also are very clear that regardless of what they think their reserve rights are going forward, they're going to pump what they need, period. And our plan going forward, this plan that we're doing, the GSP, and the plan that we develop between now and the 5-year update, whatever plan we develop for the community, that plan has to consider the fact that the Navy can and will do what they need when they need to and pump water. We have to address that. We're making assumptions now, and we're going forward the best we know and the best information we can get, but we have to adjust for that. So that's another unknown. We have a lot of basin information, a lot of information on the basin. This, Dr. Decker pointed out, very well-studied basin. We have a pretty darn good model, I think. It's been used by a lot of different people. It's been updated a couple times. We've taken it through the PAC. We have a pretty good model. I think it's a darn good model, but it can always be improved, and there are uncertainties in everything. There's uncertainties in the model. There's uncertainties in our basin knowledge that we still need to go. So there's supplemental water supplies. There's uncertainties in the basin. There's the Navy issues. There's climate change. There's potential impacts to the dependent ecosystems that we've got, the shallow dependent ecosystems that we've got to address. We've got dust control. We've got all these things that we've got to deal with. And the best way we know how to do it is to try to find a place that works for us, works for the community, and gets us into sustainability as quick as we can. But to reiterate where we're at right now, we really, frankly, we do not have surplus water to pump. We are going to do that under the GSP if it gets approved and we implement it. We are going to pump reserve groundwater. But that's a far cry from having surplus water to pump right now until we have a reliable imported water supply or a reliable recycled water supply, or we get some information that suggests and shows, demonstrates that the brackish water can help us as a bridge to get to something like a supplemental water supply. Until that happens, we don't have water to surplus water to pump right now. We're going to do it under the plan, and we're writing the plan in compliance with SGMA to pump some of that reserve storage. Not that it's surplus water, but we're knowingly going to pump some of that reserve storage to get to a place that the community can continue to survive. And hopefully, there's always time between now and imported water when it gets here, and we put a little bit of meat on that bone about whether or not we've got an imported water supply for us to use. There's always time between now and then with all the pumpers within reason. I understand that there's some issues that we may not be able to address, but we're trying the best we can to make sure that if we do develop an imported water supply that will sustain more pumping than what we've planned for between now and 2035, then we're certainly all for it. But where we're at right now with the GSP, the way it's being written right now, we have to write it so that it works in the event that we don't have supplemental water, and we got to at least generally plan for not having it, or we're going to work our tails off to try to get it. So I wasn't going to go on, but I did again. So I'm sorry about that. But that's the point I wanted to make, is that while we're doing the sustainability criteria and while we're setting all these thresholds and things that Heather's going to talk clearly about, to me, they all make sense for where we're at and the model runs we've run, what we've presented. They all make sense to me for what we're doing. But it doesn't make sense to suggest that because we're doing this, we're saying that this water can be pumped and it's surplus water, and it's really not that important. It is very important. We're trying to comply with SGMA in developing this plan. That's the key. So Heather's going to do shallow well impacts first. This is
Yeah.
on the model run 6.2 that we've already presented, and we said that we hadn't completed the work on shallow well impacts. She's going to do that first, and then she's going to provide a run-through on the sustainable management criteria.
Yes.
So here's Heather.
Okay. Last board meeting, Jeff did give a detailed presentation about the shallow well impacts. So many of you have already heard this before, and the TAC members themselves received the presentation of the results and chance to comment on that already as well. But this is because we haven't actually taken it to a TAC meeting to present these results. So this is just intended to be a brief update unless there's any new questions or concerns about it. Let's see. So I'll first start with a recap of scenario 6. The objectives that are listed there, we have seen and talked about these before, but I'm going to go over them again. It was to create an allocation management plan scenario based on that kind of rule of thumb we've been using from 2010 to 2014, analyzing the pumping then, and also taking into account highest beneficial uses of the groundwater. Another objective was to maintain the similar loss of storage as was in scenario 4, the water buyout option. But in this scenario, it was to, instead of having a ramp down, to create blocks of pumping separated into 2 different pools, the ag and industrial and what we call domestic pool. And then those blocks, I'll talk about the blocks later, but create those blocks. And so it would be a more of a cliff scenario than a ramp down. And then the last one that I have listed is we also then optimize pumping to not have those kind of negative effects of the drawdown in certain regions.
Heather, can I ask one quick
Yeah.
And there's a recharge component to 6, right? Like 3,000 to 5,000 acre feet a year?
Yes,
For
that's
6.1.
similar to scenario 4, yes.
So
That wasn't
6.1.
a change.
Okay.
That's in 6.1, not 6.2.
Well, 6.1 and 6.2 both had imported water recharge. 6.1 had additional recharge in an attempt to see how the basin would react regarding the ET and primarily the Navy area.
Yeah, it was
And-
shifted to a zone that had better hydraulic conductivity, transmissivity usage in it as well. That was commented before.
It was shifted from earlier model runs, but from scenario 4 and scenario 6.1 and 6.2 was in the same location.
Yeah. But this portion of it was in a better location that was used, so it could show it
Yes.
in the model.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I described here, this was common to both scenario 6.1 and 6.2. So regarding the blocks of this pool, oh, go ahead, Don.
Well, except that 6.2 does not have the discharge water in the water balance. It's basically ignored. So there's another 2,500 acre feet effectively available. See that 7,600 number, acre feet of recharge, is only part of the story. The natural discharge presently is about 2,500 acre
Right.
feet. And so the actual amount of water that we have available, if we could extract all of it, is
Yes.
76 minus
Minus the
2,500.
2,500, yes.
But if we, as is observed in the models, the migration of that recharge water to the playa area is really quite slow. And so, in some short-term view of the valley, you can basically ignore that, which means effectively that we're gaining 2,500 acre feet of water that we otherwise wouldn't have. And so 6.2 is that
Is that
version of the
optimization?
model.
Yes.
What I'm saying this so everybody is aware of that. Ultimately, of course, Mother Nature always wins, and what's happening at the playa today is a slow drying out because we have reversed the gradient to the playa long since by our potable water pumping around the playa, and the dust issues that are connected with that are still with us. It's not going to go away. Solving the problem by, for example, taking that 2,500 acre feet of water and applying it out there, much as has been partially done at Owens is not really something that any of us want to even think about, but that dust problem is still there. It'll have to be addressed at some point.
Yes. Okay, so for this scenario, like I said, it was the producers were divided into two groups, one being the domestic group, which included Kern County, City of Ridgecrest, the Water District, Inyo Kern Community Service District, the Chrono Supply from Searles Valley, and all the mutuals, domestic wells, and the Navy, which, so domestic group is maybe not the right term, but that was the term that we used for it. So it includes a little bit more than just private domestics, obviously. And then the non-domestic group was large ag, industrial, and small ag. For the domestic group, their allocation that was modeled was based on the lowest of the annual pumping from 2010 to 2014. And we did allow for small growth in the water district, 1% annually. So in 2020, just to give you a starting reference, all of the cumulative domestic group pumping was a little over 10,000 acre feet. Then for the non-domestic group, that included, like I said, both industrial and ag. For the ag, it was assigned based on what we knew of their acreage. Their pool volume was distributed proportionally based on acreage, and then Searles, since they're not based on acreage, was determined based on their 2010 to 2014 water use, how that was proportioned out to them. All pumping from the non-domestic pool in this scenario was required to cease by 2040, and the total pool volume, just as a reference, was around 64,000 acre feet. So this is the final summary table showing the cumulative well impacts that were simulated from scenarios 3 through 6.2 in the 5-year increments going up through 2040 and then the 2070. So in 6.1 and 6.2, you actually had the same distribution of shallow well impacts with a total of 22 wells impacted. That's the last one for that.
I was just going to point out, Heather, for those who haven't seen this for a while, if you're looking at, maybe go back one.
Sure.
If you're looking at the model runs 3, 4, and 5, for your recollection, 3 was a rough approximation. There was some discussion about things that might have been modified a little bit, but basically the white paper discussion, or what discussion paper. 4 is the one that we're using with the ramp down that's comparable to 6.1 and 6.2, and 5 was what they called sort of like the
immediate halt to pumping.
Immediate halt.
Yeah.
They used nuclear, but I don't want to use. They used the immediate halt. That was it. Stop everything right now through some kind of action. So that's why you see 5 with the least amount of impacts. That's stopping things right now. But that's the previous 3 that relate to 6.1 and 6.2.
Adam, are we going to have some opportunity for questions?
Sure. If you have additional comments or questions from the committee, we'll go on that part.
I do have some questions. The shallow well impact chart is based on water level
Yes.
alone, and it doesn't take into account water quality changes. So it's a bit incomplete, but it's what we have, and it's probably adequate for the short term.
Well, we will be getting transport results soon, and we can analyze it.
That's a very good point. Now, I should have mentioned, we were trying to get DRI done with the transport model. They're basically working on their presentation right now, but they weren't ready for today. But we will have it. As soon as we have it, we're going to give it to the TAC.
Okay. Yeah, the North Brown Road area is the one that will have the most likely water quality
impacts.
Aspects connected with it, with that area. I have a report that I am not going to try to enter into the record here verbally, but the Scenario 6 recap, the second view graph, the second slide, in the simplification into two categories, domestic and non-domestic, really results in some inaccuracies, I'll say, in the representation of those parties. The idea that the appropriate allocation is the minimum use of a given party over the 2010 to 2014 may be actually a useful distinction and decision for some of the pumpers. The de minimis pumpers, however, are not required by Sigma to meter or to report. And so there is no way to obtain the minimum.
Right. I
pumping
can clarify that 800 acre feet allocated for the private domestic wells was not altered. That was.
I assume that was the case because there is no basis for it.
The same with the Navy. They're not touched.
Yeah,
either.
that's the problem with the chart. It simplifies, but yet it doesn't, because now we have to explain that certain features that you're describing for the domestic group don't apply to the Navy, de minimis, and so on.
Right.
If you look at Sigma, the de minimis category is really separated out for a reason, and I think it needs to be a standalone identification in our GSP as well. Trying to bring it in, I'm not saying that it's just all by itself completely, but bringing it in with the other groups, since it is a de minimis, that's what it means. A lot of the requirements don't apply to it. Those that do apply, of course, absolutely need to be brought forth. The idea that, for example, the Kern County, the city of Ridgecrest, our domestic is obviously not correct either. In fact, that's irrigation water. And it needs to be identified that way. And although up to this point, the water that's going on the lawns right outside of our building here is not being seriously discussed, I think it really does need to be discussed. Everybody is expected to do their part, and a good bit of the lawn that's here it's just there for appearance. Kids to play on is one thing, but just appearance is another. That's in my report, and I won't go any further there. Steve, you gave us a really good summary background, as you oftentimes, in fact, do give us to us. One thing that would be really good would be to have some of those assumptions and other aspects that you offered, have that down as a report, something that people can look at. One of the problems that a lot of folks are having is that when one of these scenarios is offered, the assumptions that went into it are not so apparent. And I must say that I think there are quite a few people, even on the committees, that don't really understand where we are at. And the assumptions and the rationale for the assumptions, those are key things that will ultimately be in the GSP.
Oh, yeah.
And the sooner they're written down, the better. That's how I will say it. And this is not a criticism of Stetson. Everybody realizes that Stetson Engineers has been working really, really hard to try to bring the GSP around and in place. And there's a lot of things that are missing that really belong to the board and the board responsibility that none of us have any direct way to influence. And Stetson is being caught, as Steve just said, kind of in a crossfire of competing needs and desires. Not everybody's going to come out of this unscathed. And the city and the county maybe aren't going to be completely unscathed either. The water district's growth number, if that 1%, if you're going to do this fairly, all of the real domestic users should have some growth opportunity, or, as I recommend, nobody gets one until we actually have imported water. And then the growth is paid for at imported water rates. It's not subsidized off the backs of the existing customers, which is what's happening right now.
So I'll reiterate, the TAC and the board and the public have seen full presentations on Scenario 6. This was not intended to fully document all the assumptions in Scenario 6. We have given those presentations before, but to your point, you're saying people are not understanding all those, so they need to be documented more clearly. But this is maybe the third time, I think, that Scenario 6 has been presented here.
Well, my point is that before we start talking about pumping scenarios and trying to fine-tune that sort of thing, we need to have the basic assumptions that we're working against down, and we don't have that down. So one of the confusion points, one of the reasons why so much emotional reaction has occurred against the pumping scenarios is that the assumptions that underlie them haven't been presented. I'm not sure they've even been completely worked out, but that's the place where you start this discussion, not the pumping scenarios. That's my point.
And certainly we're not tied to using this type of terminology. This is in the GSP. Even when we describe this is just working groups how we categorized it. But I understand fully that those are not all domestic users in that domestic group.
That's pretty much what I have for right now. I will provide my report a little later in the end of this meeting, and I will request that it go into the record as I have before. So, and I have a few extra copies for anybody in the audience in this committee can have a copy you can study right away. And of course, you Stetson folks will have your copies too.
Thank you, Don.
And we do appreciate Stetson's really hard work, even though we pound on you guys sometimes. It's not a sport thing we're involved in here. It's a really serious matter, and the kind of the high ground of all this is preservation of the water supply for the future of the valley. That's the high ground. The short haul is not the high ground.
Okay, any other comments by committee members? All right, back to you, Heather. On this one, because it was just an update on this model set, I was not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next portion.
Okay. Next one is on the sustainable management criteria. This is an overview of the presentation we'll be giving today, a review of all the terms and what goes into setting those sustainable criteria, discussion of our approach, then discussion of the details on how we're going to be setting undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives. DWR and Sigma has defined 6 sustainability indicators. Those are the basis for creating your plans for basin management. And these 6 indicators are reduction of groundwater storage, chronic lowering of groundwater levels, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and depletion of interconnected surface water. Now to go over some of these terms and define them. Undesirable results are when those groundwater conditions of the 6 sustainability indicators become significant and unreasonable. That's how you would define an undesirable result. The minimum threshold is tied to that because that's the quantitative limit where any exceedance of that limit would produce an undesirable result. Interim milestones are the quantitative goals set in the 5-year increments as you approach your measurable objective, which is the quantitative goal that is the overall desired groundwater condition. typically at the 2040 year mark. And cumulatively, the sustainability goal is the qualitative description of how undesirable results are going to be avoided in the basin and what steps are taken to do so. Okay, as we know, groundwater and storage is a significant consideration, and the board is considering that thoroughly, and that's going to influence our project and management actions and our sustainable management criteria. So there's a listing of things that we're considering when defining a significant and unreasonable loss of storage. These are certainly the presence of the Navy, and that groundwater is considered a primary encroachment or concern for their mission. The cost, of course, to mitigate impacts due to loss of storage, including shallow wells going dry, or water quality impacts. Beneficial uses are being considered, and there's always uncertainties, as Steve has pointed out too. There's uncertainties with our model. There's uncertainties about what the Navy would actually be needing to pump, climate change, when and how much and if we're going to get imported water, and impacts to groundwater-dependent ecosystems.
And dust.
I'm sorry?
Dust.
Yes. For undesirable results, I'm going to walk through each of these indicators, the first one being the reduction of groundwater and storage. So criteria that we're looking at to establish when these undesirable results would occur are the depletion of our reserve of usable groundwater, given all those considerations on the previous slide, how much reserve would be required, and the amount of shallow wells that we're predicting to go dry based on our modeling results. So potential impacts would be encroachment on the mission at China Lake, shallow wells going dry, and the reduction to that buffer and storage. Eventually, if there's still a decline in groundwater storage, there's going to be loss of production in the deeper wells as well. For the next one, chronic lowering of groundwater levels, the criteria we're looking at is the shallow well impact analysis, when how many wells are going to be predicted to go dry. And the potential impacts for that would be the shallow wells would need to be deepened, replaced, or domestic users would need to be connected to other larger systems. For degraded water quality, we're looking at when beneficial uses would become jeopardized based on water quality. And similar to the previous one, the water user would either need to relocate or be connected to a well from a different area if there's water quality concerns. For land subsidence, the criteria we're looking at is water levels and if and when they would be reaching those clay layers where land subsidence would be occurring, if the water levels reach there. The impacts for that would be damage to infrastructure, especially to, in particular to the sensitive facilities at China Lake. Depletion of interconnected surface water, we're still evaluating how we're going to handle that in the basin. So now moving on to minimum thresholds, and again, I'll walk through each of these indicators. The first being groundwater storage. So what we're specifically looking at to set those minimum thresholds, we looked at all the results of the modeling runs of those cumulative loss of storage, and as I said, the shallow well impacts. So the method of measurement that we're proposing for calculating the change of storage would be a direct estimate calculation using the Tyson or Thiessen, sometimes called polygon method. And in that method, the basin would be divided into Thiessen polygons, which is discrete polygons that are drawn to represent an area where each point in that area is closest to the measurement point, which would be our monitoring well. Then groundwater levels would be taken at those monitoring wells, and then the change in groundwater storage would be calculated based on the groundwater levels and bulk hydrogeologic parameters for that polygon area. The next one is chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and we're looking at the results of modeling scenario 6.2 and the shallow well impact analysis. The method of measurement for minimum thresholds for that would be direct measurement of groundwater levels. For degraded water quality, we're going to be looking at results of some modeling run 6, and this was discussed briefly before. The transport results are not available yet. They're being finalized right now, and so we're going to be looking at that. And the method of measurement would be direct measurement of TDS concentrations. For land subsidence, we have the existing DRI analysis of the data that like I said, the DRI did, and then in addition to that, we would look at the lithology of where we determine those key wells and the predicted water levels at those key wells, and see if those clay layers are going to be reached by the water table. And so for that one, this is a little bit different. This is the only one that we're proposing that groundwater levels be used as a proxy. And for depletion of interconnected surface water, like I said, that's still under evaluation.
Hey, Heather, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Just because it's relevant. So on the change in storage,
Yeah.
are you just going to, and you're going to talk about this later on, I think, the proposed SMC wells, are you going to incorporate all the CASGEM wells as well in your analysis?
Yeah,
how are you going to do that?
The 13 wells that we've proposed and that I'm going to talk about later, that's so far just for the groundwater levels as the key wells. There's no reason that those have to be the same or the only ones that are used for groundwater storage. For groundwater storage, that's the one indicator that you look at it as a whole. It doesn't have to be met at discrete points like the other indicators. So in that sense, all the data that we have dividing into more polygons would give you a better accurate estimate of the loss of storage.
Well, also
so we could expand that network.
Yeah, exactly. I think what also that's going to do is, because there's been a lot of discussion with domestic wells, is we have to make sure that when this analysis is done, that we have maybe in certain areas you have more defined data points to kind of pick up on those subtleties versus in other areas you might not need as many defined points. So, or agreeing on that probably needs to happen at some point.
Yeah. Okay, so this table summarizes the indicators and whether or not we're currently seeing in the historical setting undesirable results, how we're defining them now and in the future. If there was no implementation of this GSP, if there was just baseline conditions were modeled, if we would be seeing future undesirable results, and what those proposed management actions would be to address each of these. We're going to talk about all those proposed management actions later, but they're the ones that are familiar with: imported water, recycled water, conservation, pumping limitations or restrictions. Shallow well mitigation is wrapped up in dealing with chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And as Don pointed out, dust mitigation is wrapped up in how you address loss of storage and chronic lowering of groundwater levels too. And the potential project would be the brackish water project, but I'll just discuss that later. Okay, for this table, as Steve pointed out, for overall basin management, the best thing would be if we could cut pumping back now to the safe yield, so 7650 now. Has not been deemed feasible to do that at this point, starting in 2020 to do that. So we have allowed this range up to 2040 for us to get to that sustainable level. So we are going to be seeing some further declines until we get imported water and balance things out. So for each indicator listed here, it gives kind of just a narrative description of what we're looking at for undesirable results, and then our approach for both setting the minimum thresholds and the measurable objectives. So it mostly summarizes what I talked about before. So for chronic lowering of groundwater levels, we're looking at these shallow well impacts, if production wells are impacted. And so we'd be using scenario 6.2, the predictive water levels, to set the minimum thresholds and the measurable objectives. For reduction of groundwater and storage, it's the same thing. We'd be looking at the cumulative 6.2 results for defining our minimum threshold and measurable objective. Seawater intrusion is not applicable, so we wouldn't need to continue to define any criteria for that indicator. For degraded water quality, for the minimum threshold approach, it's not fully worked out. Like I said, we don't have the transport results, but we'll be looking at the baseline transport run and the scenario 6.2 transport results and look at what % change we can expect in these wells so we can set thresholds for that. So that's still being worked on. And land subsidence, as I said, using groundwater levels as a proxy for setting it so that the groundwater levels are higher than when those clay layers are reached. I want to emphasize this is a preliminary approach for how we're going to get the GSP completed now, but we are going to be collecting a lot of data over the next few years as we start implementing these projects. And Model 6.2, which we're basing this on, it of course has a lot of assumptions and based on pumping restrictions of how we use our best judgment to estimate where that would be and our best estimate of when recycled water and imported water would be coming along. So the timing of all that and how those pumping restrictions play out, that obviously affects these results. So we will be looking at this as we get more data. These can be reevaluated in those 5-year updates to DWR.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
On setting your measurable objective, do you think it's a good idea to use the model, given that we know there's uncertainty in the model?
Yes, I do. That's the best tool that we have to set it.
And
that's going to be, I'm sorry?
No, go ahead, sorry.
And like I said, as we get more data, we can be updating the model. I anticipate we certainly would need to run another model run and get, once we firm up, I don't know when that would be, in the next year, next 2 years, when that would be, when we firm up, as we get more information, we'd run another model and use those results, see how that compared to a 6.2, look at the measured data, and then we'd be adjusting it from there. But the model is our best tool, certainly, right now.
You don't think we could set objectives based on historical data?
Well, I'll show the historical data in the next charts and how that matches with the model. And how the model was calibrated, it does really show the same trends as that historical data. So.
Yeah, I agree with the threshold approach, but the objectives, I think there's probably other ways, but that's okay.
Okay. So this figure shows what we're considering for key wells for setting groundwater levels. Like I said, when we get the transport results and storage, these could have slightly different distribution of what we consider representative key well sites. These are going to be updated and reevaluated as we get data. And of course, I want to emphasize that all wells are going to continue to be monitored and looked at, and so we can evaluate if these are the best representative sites as we move forward. So now for the next slides, I'll walk through those key wells that were on that figure, just based on model sub-area, just to keep it organized. The chart, I'll start with the first one to explain this. So it's going to show the blue line is showing the water level, historical data, the solid blue line. And then the dashed line shows, blue line shows the scenario 6.2 results. The orange is the minimum threshold, and the green is the measurable objective. So the model was calibrated by rate of change, and that has been discussed with the TAC. That was over a year ago when they did the model updates. And if you compare the slope of this historical data and the simulated data, you do see that it matches quite well, and so you see that calibration in effect here. The simulated results, like I said, are 6.2. Now, the absolute groundwater elevations of those simulated results, there is error in the model, and so those were adjusted to match the historical data of the common point. I believe it was March of 2019 was the common point from the data point of historical measured data and then our model results. But the shape and the slope, what the model is predicting, that didn't need to be adjusted. That's straight from the model. For all these graphs that I'm going to show, the vertical increment on the axis is by 5 feet. And it typically spans about 40 feet, but with some wells like this one, if there was really steep declines, it had to be adjusted. So there's a larger range on the vertical axis.
For some reason, the projected slide really doesn't resolve the dashed part of the.
Oh, okay.
You might want to.
Okay, yeah. So
point that out.
basically, if you're looking at January 20, that's 2020. Looking up anything beyond that would be the model results. That's a good point. Oh, so I should say this one, that one was USBR 03. The next one, USBR 04. The same thing applies here. MW 32. George Air Corridor, which is 01K02. There's a couple names for that. So as you see, some of these wells, they continue to decline even after we implement the management criteria or the management actions. So now moving on to the southwest, we have Steel 31L01 well.
Hey, Heather, quick question on the slide. I think it was the last one that showed that you never, I guess, sustainable.
Yeah.
How do you?
So
TWR is not going to like that.
Yeah, if you look at the map where that one is, I can go back. That is the one on the far bottom right.
Right.
On the other side of Ridgecrest. That's at the edge of the model. We have been looking at that one. If there's some constraint issues in the model, that one never seems to really change based on our model runs of what we see at that well. I can't speak certainly what's happening there. It may be that shouldn't be a Q well because it's really not adjusting to any project and management action that we do. So maybe it's not a good representative site, but because these are the wells, I mean, we're showing all of them here, but all the results here in this presentation.
So that one might be removed, just depending on kind of what.
Yeah, I don't think we have a clear understanding of what is happening at that well. I'd have to consult with Gene on that, though.
Is that at the fairgrounds?
I think
That
that's
well?
correct.
I don't know.
Yes, I think it is.
Okay.
That southeast part of the valley is basically lacustrine deposits, and there's interbedded clay after clay after clay, and the well may well be in a confined, relatively isolated little bubble.
Okay. Yeah, if that's the case, I think that's really not a great well to then set for our criteria. So now this is the northwest sub area. This is the Kermagee well. And our 205. I could stop at any of these if you like, but they're getting a little repetitive. 06.
Did you jump over the southwest?
Let's see. Southwest. Did I skip that? That was the 31 LO1. There's only one well in that one. I can back up to that one. Yeah, this slide 19. Do you see that, Don?
Yeah.
Slide 19. In the northwest, we went through the Kerr-McGee and our two.
Just a note on that one. You have 31 LO1.
Yes.
But then in the legend set, it says 32 LO1.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. '06. USBR 10. That's another one where it's in the very far north, and that also experiences continual declines. That well, like the other well, does not seem to ever react to different projects and management actions when we looked at it with other scenarios. It is away from pumping. It is further north from that, so it's not dependent on that.
Yes, it's actually in the Little Lake Gap recharge path.
Yes, it's in the recharge zone. The Navy is the Sandquist Spa well. I know Gene and Stefan has worked, and they've determined 2 other Navy wells that should be added to this criteria list of key wells for the criteria. I don't know specifically what wells those are. One is an artesian well, I know, and one's a deeper well. Oh, okay. Okay, Nicole's helping me out that the artesian well, they just drilled that this year in May, a few months ago. So we'll be adding that to the monitoring network as well. And then the last zone is the El Paso sub-area, USBR 01, and USBR 02, which is right around that fault area. So that's all the wells showing them for groundwater levels, showing the minimum threshold and measurable objective. And for storage, this is the plot of the scenario 6.2 results. And it would be that 2070 level would be where we would have to set our minimum threshold and measurable objective. And that's it, so we can discuss it.
I have some questions about slides 9 and 10. Perhaps I should have brought it up when you were at those slides.
Sure.
They have to do with
About minimum threshold?
minimum threshold.
Sure. Oops. One more?
Yes,
Okay.
that's 9, in our handouts anyway.
Yes.
The land subsidence problem, which is always a difficult territory to try to develop thresholds and objectives. The use of groundwater as a proxy could work if we had a simple situation where the clay layer that we're concerned about dewatering was well identified.
Yeah.
On North Brown Road, that may well, no pun there, that could well be the case, the organic clay that I keep bringing up. Other areas, the clays are interbedded in a pretty complex way. When we get to the brackish water element, the subsidence potential there, it's going to be a lot more complicated if the brackish water is withdrawn from a deeper zone so that extraction doesn't directly affect the potable water. Now we are, in fact, performing the exact thing that typically leads to subsidence. So your threshold, that you've got here in a one sentence, probably isn't going to be very useful.
Need to be case by case for the wells.
Yeah. Now the other thing, in your next slide, if you click to it, the land subsidence, current historical undesirable results, you have a no, but there is ample evidence of historic subsidence in at least 2 locations in the valley. One is the present Walmart location, which is the old Bowman Ranch. And you can see that depression quite readily from many directions. The other subsidence is on North Brown Road, along Brown Road, essentially from about Lee Lighter to about Neal Ranch Road, that zone. And that's the historic, really early day pumping area. So I just point that out again.
Just the presence alone of land subsidence wouldn't make it significant and unreasonable, but in these cases, it very well may be localized.
It was the subsidence together with the declining water levels is why Bowman Ranch isn't doing alfalfa anymore.
Okay, yeah.
And it's why Connie Neal isn't doing alfalfa at the old Neal Ranch. It's not just subsidence, but the water
now there's impacts to the
quality
beneficial
issues.
uses.
So there is some reference. Let me back up. It is useful to refer to historic events when they can provide some understanding of where we may end up in a more modern time. I don't think it's on this slide. It may be an earlier slide where you have monitoring of infrastructure, and you've concentrated on the Navy facility, which is appropriate. But there are a couple of Caltrans facilities that both have USGS benchmarks that really should be, if they aren't really already on your list of projects to monitor, they should be. I don't know how often those markers are actually re-examined really carefully, but they do exist. And the overpass that's we call it the 395 cutoff, that's section 17 is just north of that overpass, which is one of the sections in the valley that Jean has on her map of high water level declines. I just point this out to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a couple of comments.
Yep.
Just general. I think on some of the locations, having your objective and threshold so close together, I think it doesn't leave much operational flexibility. So you might want to look at maybe somehow coming up with a way to adjust it so you do have some room to wiggle, so to speak. It impacts the methodology, but and then the other thing is just sort of on a couple of them I was looking at. You've got an objective set, and then in some cases, because of this management action, your water levels have actually risen 10 or 15 feet, which is okay. But remember, SGMA, right, exactly. Right? Yeah. But SGMA's not a restoration program, and also the repercussions of having that rebound could be taking some people out of business. I think you have to be really sensitive to making sure you're managing that water level, within the objective. So if your objective is, set too high, or too low, maybe increasing that a little bit to building and some flexibility.
Okay.
I think I think part of the challenge is you're using the model to set the objective. But I think you need to be careful about that because you don't want to see significant water level rises in certain areas when certain folks have been could be potentially driven out of business. And again, in the Sigma world, Sigma's not a restoration program. It's like, hey, we want to be sustainable,
Right. We did optimize some of the pumping, and there's a lot of assumptions of where we moved pumping around.
Right.
And that affects those recovery at those wells too.
Right.
So.
And then the other question was, have you given it much thought on, okay, hopefully we never get there, but let's say in there's certain areas you're going to hit a threshold. What is the management action to sort of evaluate that? What do? You can't say, one idea would be, hey, if you hit the threshold for 2 or 3 consecutive monitoring events, then you need to make some change. So that some of those details have to go into the GSP. And then I guess another question, Steve will probably want to answer this one. I look at this as a management scenario, and I know you're going to talk about other management scenarios, but are you going to kind of go through a similar exercise on additional management scenarios? As an example, let's say we ran this scenario utilizing the brackish water project, trying to compare and contrast costs, impacts to users. That needs to be part of the analysis.
I'm not fully understanding. You're saying setting minimum thresholds and objectives for different scenarios?
So you've got your scenario that you presented with your objectives and thresholds. Now, how does that compare against other project management actions? And does that make sense? So scenario 6.2 is a scenario, but you want to compare that to what? To a baseline scenario? What is the difference, or what is the cost? Comparing it to a brackish water project, comparing it to, let's say we decided to bring in imported water. You kind of have to compare those scenarios.
Well, all that was wrapped into scenario 6.2. Those results include all of the projects and management actions that we're planning on right now.
Okay, what about, let's say there was I haven't looked at your project management scenarios. Maybe we can talk about that when we get to that part.
I think one of the things you're looking for, Eddie, would be, as Heather pointed out, we worked our way through the different model runs to get to the one primarily around shallow well impacts and such, the one that was reasonably acceptable, and the amount of water we're going to pull out of storage, the reserve water we talked pull out of storage. So we kind of got there to that. And so there were comparisons of other scenarios to that point. But I think what you're talking about is once you get there, where is there going to be an economic comparison of that option versus another option or something like that? And we've done it a little bit because we've looked at, for example, shallow well impacts for the different model runs. How many wells would be impacted? What's the cost there? What's the cost there? One we haven't done certainly is the brackish water project, because I think we're still waiting for the model runs to be completed and evaluated for that. And I don't know that we're going to have that for the GSP, but we certainly do want it. We certainly do want that. So
does that mean that we can make alterations and then submit that when we're doing our 1-year or 5-year presentation to
certainly for the 5-year? I'm not sure what the 1 year
using a
look
different
like.
scenario?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. You brought up, Eddie, the distinct possibility that we may have some wells in our actual scenario that we're going to ultimately execute. We may have some wells that end up with rising water levels, and you expressed two different aspects that I heard. One is Sigma is not a restoration project, which I think we all totally understand and agree, although since our management actions, that is areas that we are changing pumping or maybe we have recharge, those are discrete locations. So there may be some locations that have rising water levels as a bonus. It's not a direct intended consequence, but we can't totally control it. The other thing I heard you saying, I think, was that rising water levels for some parties may actually be problematic. Did I mishear that?
No, I didn't say that. If I did, I was mistaken. So
Okay.
No, I think no, I wouldn't say that.
Well, I couldn't imagine that would be the case unless, of course, someone ended up with an artesian well in their backyard and it was washing through their house, but we could all hope we had such a thing.
It might have too many TDSs in it, too.
So I'd like to pull the string a little bit on the dust issue that was initially presented or discussed by Dr. Decker. Since it's not one of our 6 sustainability indicators and it's not required to even be addressed formally by the state in our GSP, we know it's a problem here. How do we inextricably join that issue with one of these sustainability factors so we don't lose track of it? Is one part of my question. The second piece is given that that is going to be or could be a problem, and as Dr. Decker also has pointed out, the levels in the playa right now are already lowered to a point where we are beginning to see some early indications of dust in certain circumstances. Do we have our monitoring wells for our sustainability factors properly prioritized in such a location that we would be able to predict or sense that lowering water table in the playa early enough to take appropriate actions?
Yeah, I would agree that it's not something that directly has to be addressed with SGMA, but we do want this GSP to be a management plan for this basin. And it is an indirect result of these indicators. So I think it will be addressed in the GSP as that this has to be mitigated and going forward as part of this, but I don't think we're going to have a mitigation plan included in the GSP for that. That's how we're addressing it right now.
I think, Heather, you're right. It's not part of the SGMA requirements. You're right. It's clearly an issue here, and we hear that, and it's going to be in the GSP. I think, as Heather pointed out, we're going to cover it the best we can, and we're certainly going to put information that we're going to gather as part of preparing the GSP on methods to address dust mitigation or dust control. And I also, on a separate line, I know that in our discussions through the Groundwater Authority, the team that we have with the general managers and the attorneys and such in our office, I know that we're looking at dust control and dust mitigation issues being addressed in the planning of the administrative budget for the authority going forward, use of the pump fee, how we're gonna do all this. It's in there too. So it is being considered. We don't have any real good guidelines, certainly from SGMA to do it, but we are looking at it. So that's a very good question.
Yeah, and in the case of Inyo County, LA was straddled with the bill to mitigate the issues on the lake, and we don't have a bill payer to help us here unless there's a state fund that helps deal with dust mitigation issues that maybe, I'm not familiar if there is such a source of funds. But okay.
Good question.
The city of Los Angeles has very deep pockets. They have ratepayers.
Absolutely.
Owens Lakes, 103 square miles, 40-some square miles have been modified. It's pushing $2 billion. That's why they like gravel. It's cheap.
And that's your suggestion that Bee Mountain might be not in our future.
Just wanted that for impact.
The Bee Mountain is of the order of magnitude of what would be required. Okay. I think what we just heard from Heather and Steve is pretty much what all of us would suspect is the route that we can and should take. The dust problem is an indirect result of what we've been doing to our basin so far. And as we enter into a managed basin era, paying attention to the discharge flows will be part of that effort. I don't think, though, that we'll ever be able to manage that dust with water. Not here. And so that part of it, graveling, you can imagine such a thing. The Navy, it's quite possible the Navy might execute a project on their own for certain areas, but you got to be really careful about your gravel. You don't want rocks coming up in the 100+ mile an hour winds flying around.
We had talked about water usage for dust abatement for fallow agricultural zones potentially in the future, which was bandied around during the last, I think, during the PAC. Perhaps it was during a GA, but I totally agree that there's not enough water to deal with that. But the fact that we're altering the water table and it's lowering the water in the playa, are you suggesting that we shouldn't be worried about that lowered water in the playa, or are you just saying we don't want to use additional water to deal with the dust problem in the playa?
I'm talking about additional water,
right.
But the water migration to the playa is at such a low rate that even if we had a deliberate plan to provide for additional water reaching the playa, it wouldn't do us any good in the near term at all. That's the result from the latest DRI modeling, in fact.
Right.
That's the distinction between 6.1 and 6.2, as a matter of fact.
I had two questions. One's for Don. So as you sort of represent the domestic well owners, do you feel pretty comfortable with the key wells that have been identified and sort of the thresholds and objectives that are set? I mean, would you like to see more wells in there?
I would like to see more wells. I think, but I think what's there is arguably adequate. But there are some areas in the valley that don't have very good coverage, and of course it's not for lack of trying, I think. The area that's west of Inyukern and both north and south by some few miles is notably not very well covered. And it's right in a major recharge path from the Sierra, such as it may be.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that as we kind of move forward and we're kind of managing to these key wells, that everybody sort of feels comfortable in the data that's being collected. One of the things that kind of jumps out to me, at least in USBR 6, and I believe it's a shallow well, since about 2012, water levels have been relatively stable, if you kind of look at the slide. And so we just need to make sure that if there's domestic wells in that area, which maybe are suffering, greater changes in that needs to be kind of incorporated somehow into this specific area.
The BR6 is right at the turn in Brown Road, the north Brown Road area. It's just inside the Navy fence, and there are domestic wells within certainly, I would say, half a mile of there. And some of those wells are showing minimum declines also.
Okay, so they kind of correlate then with that. So that's a representative.
There's a patch there that has been noticed going way back in time that is relatively stable. You can imagine what may be causing that.
Right.
But we don't.
Okay.
So I don't think that that's a totally peculiar condition, BR6.
Okay. And then Heather, one question was just sort of an update, general update on GDEs. What's the latest on that with groundwater dependent ecosystems?
Yeah.
Are we going? I mean,
I don't have a great update on that
Okay.
right now.
okay.
We are still considering that.
Sure.
That's going to be wrapped into our groundwater levels and making sure that the new Navy wells that are going to be monitored, we need to plot that and look at that data and see what, and since those are new wells, we're not going to have historical data, so
Sure.
we're going to have to collect some data there too. It is partially going to be a data gap in the GSP that's going to have to continue to be looked at.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, the groundwater dependent ecosystem issues are very closely tied to the potential dust in the same
Right.
general area. There actually are a substantial number of wells, maybe no longer functional. They were all monitoring wells that were put in many years ago.
Navy wells?
Sure. Because this issue of the shallow groundwater has been monitored for a very long time for different reasons.
Well, while we've got Steve here and his list of items to accomplish before January is certainly attainable, perhaps we should add the Tui Chub challenge on his list, given that that was introduced to us by an environmental action that imported the Tui Chub here in the 70s. Perhaps we need to import them somewhere else.
It is in the GSP. I'm not sure who we're assigning it to, but it's in the GSP. Nobody's volunteered.
I'd be very careful. There's a chewy chub in there that's named Mick.
Well, what's interesting, I did hear on a site tour there that population is one of the healthiest chewy chub populations. So so there could be other environmental hurdles to getting those moved too because of that.
Didn't say it was going to be easy.
Not going to be easy. And we welcome suggestions, any suggestions on who to talk to or where to go, because it's part of the Navy situation, and there's other people have better access to the Navy than we do. But yeah, it could be a big help.
Yeah, to that point, we're welcoming comments, obviously, on all of this. We are moving fast on our timeline. If you guys can look through this and give comments in a week on sustainable management criteria in particular, that would be very helpful for us.
Thank you for mentioning that, Heather. I was also going to mention we have already begun to receive comments.
Okay.
Tim Parker has sent in his, and he asked that I just let you all know
Great.
that those have come in, so that Stetson already has them.
Perfect.
So more encouragement to all of us that we can send our comments as well.
Yes.
Right to them.
Thank you.
Let's see, because this is the
A
sustainable
comment.
management criteria set, I will go ahead and open this up to the public for your comments.
Just a
And then-
moment. I have one
Okay.
added comment.
And we'll come back to us as well.
Oh, okay.
But,
Oh.
yeah, hold tight on that one, Earl, for us.
Wes Katzenstein, member of the PAC and of the Domestic Well Owners Association. Regarding the dust problem, it's my understanding that it's up to us, up to the Groundwater Authority, to identify undesirable results in our basin, that they're not necessarily written in Sigma. And I think from that point of view, a dust problem is clearly an undesirable result, and I think we are empowered to identify that as such in the preparation of the plan.
Hello, TAC, Derek Hoffman, attorney from Meadowbrook. If Jeff's watching, I wish him well and a speedy recovery. Thanks, Steve and Heather, for your presentation. This is helpful, and it's appreciated, the additional transparency and just sharing with us kind of your thoughts and where you're headed. We appreciate that. I just had a couple questions about some of this preliminary information on the slides, and I'll just kind of give a couple examples. When I look at USBR 3 and USBR 6, for example, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. My question is, if I'm reading them correctly, it looks like the minimum threshold is set at a different level between those two. Eddie had mentioned earlier that the difference between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective on each of these slides varies. The gap is tighter in some and larger than others. Yeah, that one, please. Thanks. So USBR 6, it looks like the minimum threshold, and again, I get this as preliminary, but it's set just above 2165. And then if you go to USBR 3, if you go to USBR 3, yeah, it looks like the minimum threshold is set about 2145, or approximately, about 20 feet lower. And than the minimum threshold for USBR 6.
Yeah, we use just the minimum of that chart for each individual well. They're all going to have the different minimum thresholds.
Sorry, well, can you clarify that? Yeah. My question is, are they set at different levels, and if so, can you share with me why they're set at different levels?
Yes, each well has a different level for both the measurable objective and the minimum threshold. It is summarized in the table of the approach that for chronic lowering of groundwater levels, the minimum threshold is set at the minimum of what was the modeled results. So wherever that minimum is for that particular well is where we set the minimum threshold. So I can't read that far, but we're at what level that is.
That's at 2145, 2144.
And then the measurable objective is set at the 2040 mark. That's where it crosses. So each
objective is at about 2052, 52 or 53, 2152.
So each well would have a unique threshold and objective.
I mean, the other one you were talking about,
it's the same thing for
minimum threshold
6.
was set at 2160, I think you said. And we would already be there as part of the problem. So these are based on we're using the model basically for those locations, but we can respond to that.
Thank you. We can talk more about that. That was my question, though, just understanding where those lines are coming from. And if I'm hearing correctly, you're saying it comes from the points in the model scenario.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's not actually pumping data that you see on the left.
Right.
Am I correct?
To the right of January 2020 is the simulated data.
Levels.
Okay, those are physically measured levels that we have.
On the left.
Right.
On the left, yes, is the historical data.
It looks like this one has 2019 maybe in it already.
Yes, all of the data had up through the March 2019 KCWA
That was the
water.
KCWA
Yes.
data.
Yeah, we have the spring levels in there.
So all the blue on the left of the 2020 is real data.
Correct.
Thank you.
So that becomes our objective then for that well, is what's based on KCWA's data.
Yes, so the simulated results are just to set these thresholds and objectives.
So all this
but
is
as
showing
we
what-
monitor, it's going to be the real data. That's how we're going to be
So all this is
evaluating.
doing right now is showing us our objective based on this most current model set.
Correct.
Okay.
It's not easy to see, but there is a bit of overlap of the dotted line of the model projection and the historic a few years.
Yes, that's because the model started in 2017. There was a burn-in period in the model before 2020.
You did mention that.
Right, and the thing that I think Heather wanted to point out was that when you look at that and you look at the trends, that we're comfortable looking at it. We're not in any way at all suggesting that we're 100% know that everything's exactly right, but we're comfortable looking at it. See, the trends of the model are very, very. They're following the trends of the historic groundwater levels very well going forward with the same kind of pumping that we had anticipated until we get the pumping cut back. So we do see some good trend lines between the model and the historic.
On the model.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
May I just follow up with one brief comment then? May I? For 6.
You had your 5 minutes.
I agree. I recognize that. Thank you for. I appreciate this. So just by way of observation, then, if you look at USBR 6, that historical data suggests that as of very recently, you're currently operating at that currently defined measurable objective. And it's
Yes.
only when you interfere that the spike occurs and then it's brought back down based in part on that pumping optimization that you mentioned.
Right.
But
Correct.
I'm kind of suggesting that it's already at the measurable objective. Thank you.
The thing that makes the problem of setting thresholds difficult, of course, is that water levels vary considerably around the basin because we have had decade after decade of pumping in different areas and different quantities. We have totally disturbed the natural equilibrium that was here 100 years ago. And so you see things like the differences in elevation between BR6 and BR3 that are separated by 30 miles. So they're not neighboring by any imagination. So I offer that as partly a help to understand why there are these differences that we're looking at.
Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Mead, for the record. There's been a huge amount of time spent on the concerns of the shallow well impacts, rightfully so. But I have a couple of questions. Did this committee have input into the creation of the well registration form?
The domestic well owners did in fact produce a form, which is not the form that was out on the table. And we did have input. Much of what we offered, though, was not very well accepted.
Are you talking about the original one that's in effect now, or the new one for the current pub fee registration?
The August 2019 well registration
That's the
form.
new one.
That's based. That is based on the original well registration form for the current pub fee that's in place, and that form was ran by the TAC and the PAC and the board.
As a draft.
Okay, so the August 2019 well registration form, that is the one that we're using? That's the one that
I don't know where you got the new one that
Is out there?
got posted.
it came from the IWV GA website.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
But this is not what the GA board approved at the last meeting. I will
So
point
we're
that
sending a
out.
well registration form out that's different than what the GA approved?
I can't speak to the full process, but we did have the draft form that the board looked at, and then they approved modifications, and staff made those modifications,
At
and
the
that's
board
what
meeting,
this.
yeah.
The last board meeting, they did approve the general form, and we took their comments and incorporated them.
And she said staff, it was not us, but it was staff. So,
Okay.
just so you know.
So okay, that's as clear as mud. Thank you. Could someone give me a quick refreshment on the purpose of registering the wells that are not subject to fees? Just real quick, just short, abbreviated. I do have a point here, guys.
I also need to remind everybody, this is the TAC.
Yes, I realize
and these
that.
are questions definitely for the board and even at the PAC meeting that's looking into this.
Okay, but I know.
I know. I'm just reminding everybody. But if we do have a quick answer,
Right, doing the
Stephen?
best we can, because this is being done by legal, not by us and not even by the staff. I think it's associated with their ability to do pump fees going forward, potential Prop 218 issues, that they have to do that first, I think.
Okay. All of that being said, when I look at the form, there's several questions that just jump out at me that are not on the form. Maybe they were on the domestic well owners forms. I don't know. The very first one I would ask is your well active? There are a large amount of wells in this valley that are sitting out in the middle of a piece of property that are not being used. There's probably no intent, and when this is finalized, they will probably never be used. If that's in your count and you're assigning those 2 acre-feet as your projection, that could change what the domestic well owner's allocation would look like. The other thing I would ask is, have you deepened or altered your well? That's not on there. If so, what did you do and why? Another question would have been, have you replaced your well? If so, why? There's a lot of reasons besides losing water to replace your well. The other question I would ask is, are you a customer of the water district and also have a well? Those are my questions on the well registration form. And there's really not a place to ask those questions other than during discussions of shallow well impacts. And to Adam's comment, yes, I will be asking the same questions at PAC and the GA. Then if I could clarify with Don Decker, you mentioned a section 17 referring to having large declines in the water table. What's the township and range of that section?
I can't tell you right off the top of my head, but you can identify it easily enough. It's the section 17 that's just north of the substation there at 395 and Indian Kern Road. It's right straight north. So
okay.
You can
yes,
you can identify it.
Yes, I can. And did I understand you, Heather? Did you say there was an artesian well drilled in this valley?
Yes.
Do you know when and where?
Yes, on the Navy property, and you said in, I think it was May 2019. You can't hear.
May of 2019 on Navy property.
And it has artesian properties. It's not fully artesian.
Oh, okay.
Nicole, can we actually have you come on up and mention that? Thank you.
So it has artesian properties. So it's having flow up from the lower screen interval and not flowing from the surface. Not fully artesian.
So it's a pressure zone.
Yeah. In a more consolidated zone or underneath within the aquifer, it's under greater pressure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Camille Anderson, Searles Valley Minerals. I just have a question regarding the shallow well failures in the Model 6 models. That Model 6, you're changing multiple variables, and I'd like to know if the lower number of the shallow well failures are due mainly to the lower overall pumping, the moving of pumping from some of the dense pumping areas to areas of less dense pumping, or is it due to the injection of groundwater, of imported water? I'm assuming Model 6 is a combination of all those. I just want to know which one of those 3 variables is the most important variable regarding shallow well failure.
It's a good question, though. Send it over. We'll find out for sure what's the driver of the reduction of wells from 4 to both modeled run 6.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Judy Decker. I represent the Eastern Kern County Resource Conservation District. I have a comment and then I have a question. My comment is, you mentioned that this little package on scenario 6.2 had been vetted several times, but every time it's presented, there is something different in it. So it is not the same. And I have a question. I'm not a geologist or a hydrologist, and I'm not a physicist either, as Don will plainly tell you. But my concern is we have a certain amount of water in storage. We're not sure exactly how much. One thing we do know from drilling deep wells is the deeper that we go, and it doesn't seem to matter if we're in the southwestern part of the valley or in the northwestern part of the valley or in the middle of the valley, the deeper we go, the tighter the formation is. The less water that can be removed in a given time, and the poorer the quality of that water. And you spent a lot of time talking about how we're going to have to continue going forward as is for some undetermined length of time that hasn't quite been figured out yet. And so my concern is that over time, should everybody continue pumping, should the Indian Wells Valley and the city grow at 1% or more, we're going to need more local water. And I know you haven't gotten the results yet back, and you're about to on TDS, but that's the concern. We know, for instance, about Neal Ranch. What's going to happen in the future to TDS and mutual wells, co-op wells, small outfits like the Indian Kern CSD, and water treatment? We all know that in the past 10 or 15 years, the federal government and the state government have ordered tighter and tighter restrictions on water quality. And I realize you don't have time to do it in the next 2 months, but I think it needs to be on your agenda to look at water treatment and the reduction in water quality over time. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other public comments? Okay, we'll come back to the committee, but first I'm going to go over to Earl.
I concur with Tim about what his comments were. And I don't have them in front of me.
Tim Parker's comments?
Yes.
Okay.
Just wanted to let you know.
Thank you.
We're running behind and we need to start dealing with some other pending things. One was addressed today. We're setting limits along which, seeing as how the slide's still on there, I see pumping responses in that slide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's there all through it.
Yeah. Why is the model overlaid on that? That was 6.2.
Those pumping responses are responses to pumping which is external to this well.
Yes, I agree.
That are close enough to produce an effect.
Yep.
Hey, Heather, I know you did a good job of explaining it, but I was sort of distracted. Can you explain the adjusted, again, just so I can sort of better understand what do you mean by how you adjusted that?
Sure. I think you guys have reviewed the model documentation too, and that goes into some errors or errors in the water levels compared to what we would likely be seeing. I think it was plus or minus 14 feet was in the model documentation, but I don't have that in front of me. So the results of the the water levels that the model produces could be 14 plus or minus 14 feet above what we're seeing as the historical. So I matched, the common point was the March 2019 level. So I either raised or lowered the simulated to match the historical data so that we could see the trend and the shape, but which remain unchanged.
Okay. Does that assume the pumping continues because we're still seeing a pumping response?
Yes, pumping is continuing. That doesn't affect that.
So you adjusted the head
Yes.
at that point, or you adjusted the general head boundaries by that much?
The model output is monthly timestamps, and each month was adjusted by that incremental amount so that the March 2019 or April 2019 value matched from the simulated and the measured.
But then when you use the model to predict out into the future, that error is still going to come back in, right?
Well, it's all adjusted each monthly timestamp.
But what about the recharge component, the heads from the general heads? I mean, that error is eventually going to get picked back up in the model.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, it will, because, it will, because unless that head value is calculated, so for you to force that head value, lower it by 14 feet, that's one input in the model, but then you have other variables that are used to calculate that head, so it's going to get picked back up. So as the model runs into the future,
right, but we're not intending to use the model in the future for using these.
But you're setting the
We're setting it based on them because that's what we have now. But as we collect data, that's how we're going to measure whether or not we're hitting those thresholds.
Real data.
Yes, real data.
Yeah, okay. I'll get you some comments why I think we shouldn't use the model to set the objective for sure because of that error. But
So what I see in this is you've created a situation with the model where you drag out the same situation until 2070, and we're right back where we started.
So the key thing to look at is the response and the shape, because that is not altered. So you are seeing recovery based on the projects and management actions. When you see, maybe 6 isn't the best one because we're basically at it, but these wells that recover, we're anticipating seeing that recovery still in the measured data as we move forward.
The way we're setting up, Earl, is that we need to have sustainability demonstrated by 2040. Right. I think the one you're looking at primarily is the water taken out of storage, which is the last one, which continues to show storage decline. And it's primarily because of the evapotranspiration issue. In that particular model, we didn't put water into account for that because we didn't see the benefit. And we're going to have to address that. But the goal right now is sustainability at 2040 and then working forward.
You know, if you didn't use the model to set thresholds, you could do almost an identically equivalent job by just extrapolating the historic behavior of the well.
Except for we wouldn't show recovery.
No, I'm just saying setting thresholds.
The minimum, yes.
Surely, the model gives you that ability to
yes, and
to look
this is
into
a
the
good
future.
example where you see that the slope of the simulated and the slope of the measured is the same.
Yes,
so
that's my point.
Mm-hmm.
The model, you can say, well, we used the model to set thresholds, and perhaps that really was done, but you can completely ignore the model and come up with almost the identical result from extrapolation of the measured data.
Yes.
That's my point.
Yes, for the minimum thresholds, we could certainly do that. For the measurable objective, that's where we need the model to show, to predict the basin response with all of our management actions implemented.
Yes. While we're on this slide, why are the minimum threshold and the measurable objective only a foot or so apart? There's a mistake there, right?
No, the 2040 level was used to set the measurable objective, and the 2040 level happens to be closest to the minimum, which is what was used to set the minimum threshold. So there is obviously more recovery that we're predicting, but if you set the measurable objective to where we think it'll be at 2070, that would mean if you look at 2040, we're actually not meeting our objective for sigma. So even though we know that it's going to still recover, if you set it at the 2070 levels, then we'd technically be in compliant.
Well, then I go back to what I just said. 1 foot difference between the objective and...
There's not a lot of operational flexibility there.
No, that is unrealistically tight.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. Maybe that's what you were talking about, Eddie.
That was Eddie's point,
I didn't notice that totally until we just bumped it up again by accident.
Yeah, there's a few wells that's the case.
Well, then go back to what I just said. You can set the thresholds by extrapolation of the existing data, and then use the model to provide a look into the future. But setting the minimum threshold the way it was done here makes no sense.
The minimum threshold or the objective?
Minimum threshold, yeah. You have no, there's no way to manage this well. That's such a tight range that it's, you're going to be above or below by amounts you can't possibly control.
Well, plus
but
the
if we use the historical data to your first point, you would still get the similar minimum threshold. So using the simulated or the measured and extrapolating the slope of that, you'd still get the same minimum threshold. So what you're looking for is operational flexibility with the objective then, correct?
Well, then there needs to be an override, an adjustment here, which I think is what Eddie was talking about, something like 10 feet of difference between those values is appropriate, at least as a starting point.
Right.
Yeah. If we can't move the measurable objective, then the only alternative is to move the minimum threshold down a little bit. Yeah. But we'll
if we move the minimum threshold down, that would mean that we're allowing more shallow well impacts than what we've set as reasonable, and that can be mitigated. So the minimum threshold is kind of fixed on. You can either do it by the historical slopes or the simulated data. I understand that, but either way, that's where we're kind of setting that there's undesirable results past that. So there could be flexibility in how you set the objectives, and especially in wells that we know that they're going to recover higher than what the 2040 levels are showing.
I think you'll get some good comments back.
Yeah, get some comments back. And we might be selective on the ones that we actually include for DWR to see that we're using for these thresholds and objectives, the ones that make the most sense. From you?
We've gone through quite a bit of time, and we still got quite a lot here, and you're welcome to chat with them afterwards, but because we did already come back through the public comment timing. So. Okay, if there's no other comments or questions from the committee, we'll go ahead and move on to 3C.
Sure.
This is Heather again.
Welcome back, Heather.
Thank you. Okay, this presentation is going to go through the plans and potential projects and management actions that we're including in the GSP. So we're writing that chapter. It'll be imported water that I'll talk about, recycled water, pumping restrictions, conservation, and brackish water. So we are grouping these projects into, like I said, planned and potential. The planned projects that we're basing, like I said, our model 6.2 has all these in there, is imported water, recycled water, pumping restrictions, and conservation, which actually I misspoke. That's not directly in the management, the modeled management scenario, but we are going to be addressing conservation in our plan as well. And then the potential projects are brackish water, or there could be others that are proposed sometime during the planning horizon that then will be incorporated into 5-year updates as other projects are proposed and implemented. So the goal of all these projects and management actions is to mitigate the overdraft and to avoid and mitigate undesirable results. In the GSP, these project and management actions are going to be described with the following these sub-bullets. It will be the description, an estimate of the cost, the schedule, a description of permitting requirements and regulatory requirements and the process for that, and any implementation, the process for that, circumstances like public noticing, as an example. The first one I'll talk about is imported water. There are 2 potential options that we're still evaluating. That would be option 1 is the partnership with LADWP to wheel or exchange water through the LA Aqueduct. And that one would be require construction of new facilities to convey the raw water from the aqueduct. Thank you. Option 2 is the partnership with AVEC, and that would mean wheeling external water supplies through existing AVEC facilities and then constructing a new pipeline north from California City to the basin, and that would be to convey treated water. So that could be used for direct use. Both options require the purchase of external water rights or supplies somehow, and that could be, but not limited to, looking at Table A entitlement from the State Water Project, nickel water, water that's from north of the Delta, banked water, or other supplies. And as we know, Capital Corps is currently working on these strategies. Option 1, LADWP, the new infrastructure would be a turnout with aqueducts, pipelines, constructing the spreading grounds, recovery wells, treatment facility, chlorination, and storage tanks. Option 2, AVEC, would require the pipeline, booster pumps, and storage tanks. So now we can look at the costs. This first table, the assumption is that no grant fees are available, so these are the total estimated costs for these projects. Option 1, if you amortize these capital costs, one-time costs, and O&M costs, amortize the first option is at 4%, or the second option is at 2%, just to give a range. It comes to a little over $2,000 per acre foot, or just under $2,000 per acre foot, depending on the interest rate. Option 2 is AVEC. There's a lot higher capital costs associated with AVEC due to the distance from California City is from this basin. So the cost per acre, the unit costs are higher. They come out to $4,250 if it's amortized at 4% interest rate, or $3,650 if at 2%. So the next table is a comparison. The assumptions here, just for illustrative purposes, is if 1/2 of the capital costs for infrastructure are covered by grants. So the only difference between the table before and this table is that the capital costs are cut in half, and you see the results of that in the far right columns where you have the unit costs. Both of those unit costs then for both options go quite a bit down. Okay. Moving on to recycle water. The project would be using tertiary treated effluent from the Ridgecrest wastewater treatment facility. And there's two options. Project one would be using that recycled water for non-potable reuse as landscape irrigation. And there's a sub-project, Project 1A of that, where the pipeline could be extended to the Saracoso Community College and for landscape irrigation there. So that's one option that is being considered. Project 2 would be using recycled water for indirect potable reuse. That would require advanced treatment. That's a state law. If you're going to inject recycled water, it has to be treated to a higher level than tertiary treatment. And then to the point that we talked about before, this recycled water study did assume that the Chewich Hub is maintained here, and there could be additional recycled water available if the Chubb are relocated. This is a proposed map showing the recycled water infrastructure network. The purple lines are where the recycled water pipelines would be. The green shaded areas would be landscaping within the city or the water district service area. And the blue shaded areas would be where landscaping with recycled water could occur on the Navy base. The area on the far bottom, that's where Saracoso Community College is. So you see, if you want to incorporate Saracoso, that's a significant extension of the pipeline if you're going to incorporate that into the landscape project. So new infrastructure required for the recycle project would be the tertiary treatment facility upgrades, but those are not included in our cost estimates because that's a city project that's currently underway. So the costs that I'm going to show in the next slide don't incorporate that. What would be included is the recycled water distribution system. So that would require the pipelines, booster pump station, retrofits at each of those landscape facilities so that they could use the recycled water versus the currently potable water that they're using, and meters and backflow prevention devices. For the advanced treatment facility, if you're doing injection, that would require full advanced treatment, so microfiltration, RO, oxidation. And then it would require the construction of the deep injection well. This table shows the cost. Again, the two far right columns show the unit costs if they were amortized under two different options, 4% and 2% interest rates. For project one, which is the irrigation project, it comes out to around $3,000 per acre foot under 4% and about $2,500 under 2% interest rate. The project 1A, that addition of the Saracoso, this is an incremental cost, so if that is included in the landscape project, the unit costs increase to $3,700 and just over $3,000 at the two different interest rates. Project 2, which is the recharge and requires the advanced treatment of the tertiary treated recycled water, is more expensive, and that would be $5,000 acre feet at 4% or down to $4,220 at 2% interest rate. The same as the assumptions that we did for importer water, just for illustration purposes. The second one now shows if half of the capital costs were, here it is, if half of the capital costs were covered by grants. So you see that the respective reduction in all the unit costs if the capital costs are lowered. Next, project and management action is pumping restrictions. A lot's been discussed about what was included in the model for that. But the pumping restrictions, they will be implemented after verifying current pumping. We made assumptions in the model, but There would be a whole verification process to make sure that that's accurate what we have and we have the latest information. And these restrictions would be implemented after considering reasonable beneficial uses. That's also in consideration. So, like I said, the assumptions in 6.2, that was based on our judgment, our understanding. That does not mean that that's what's going to be implemented, because specific plans are still under consideration. A lot of that has to do with the work that Jim Markman's doing and negotiations he's having with different parties.
And Heather, just one quick question. So,
Yeah.
so do you envision in this PMA section, when it talks about pumping restrictions, you'll have some kind of similar cost table?
Yeah, I guess we would have to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, there would be no additional capital costs, obviously, but yeah, to be consistent.
There could be. Yeah. Okay.
Quick question for memory purposes. Within the modeling setup for the pumping restrictions, the timing that's used, is that a 5-year timing then before the blocks take place?
The timing used in scenario 6.2?
Yeah.
Yes, that was 2010 to 2014.
Okay.
That was the basis of how we allocated the water in that scenario.
Okay, that's what I just wanted to make sure.
Mm-hmm. And with these pumping restrictions and with, like we talked about with the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, dust control is going to need to be evaluated, because as we have those continued declines, there likely will be more problems associated with dust. Next one would be conservation measures. Just a recap, this I don't think has been discussed with the TAC for quite a while, conservation. This is a listing of the current conservation measures, kind of a summary of them that we're aware of. The Water District has a tiered rate structure to support conservation, and they have, along with the City of Ridgecrest, adopted various water conservation ordinances. There's also prohibitions on decorative water usage, like in fountains. They have been distributing water conservation fixtures at certain public events too, and lots of community outreach that the Water District does to raise awareness on conservation. And China Lake, the Navy has certainly done some conservation efforts for their water usage as well. There are potentials for additional water conservation. The slide here kind of breaks them up by water use for the municipal or residential. There could be seasonal water use restrictions. We could expand the current pilot projects that are being done on water audits and leak detection and rebate programs. Those are being implemented for the SDACs, but that could be expanded to a larger audience for that. And replacement of evaporated coolers, if some sort of program was implemented to replace those with other air conditioning units that use less water. A type of potential opportunity for conservation with ag would be updating their irrigation systems to use efficient water devices, et cetera. And industry, there's a potential for Searles to use recycled water or brackish water in their process, but of course that would be subject to approval from Searles of what they can and can't use.
I have a comment while we're on this slide. I pointed this out before. Going to an AC air conditioning does not save the amount of water you think it does, because invariably there is a humidifier that is part of that system that is directly consuming water. It is no doubt is lower than the evaporative cooler, but it is not the savings that most people think that it is.
Okay.
And if you don't have that additional humidity and that you're actually living in that low humidity environment, you will get sick.
Yeah. The last one I don't have very much on is the brackish water project. This is going to be included in the GSP as a potential project. It is still under evaluation, so we did receive a project description from Wade recently, and that's going to be incorporated into the GSP, and we're still waiting to see other model results as they come, and we'll update it as appropriate with that project. That's all.
Okay, committee members, any comments, questions for her on this?
Yes, please. I might have missed part of the presentation while I was getting your refreshment there. The water options that you discussed, the importation, I think during a GA board meeting, perhaps this was discussed by the Inyo County supervisor, who wasn't real excited about using the LA Aqueduct as a wheeling device. But one of the things that was being considered at the time was, I think, in the water importation studies, was to offload directly water from up north and then replace it with water into the aqueduct down in the Cal City area. So we'd be basically, it would be net zero difference in your county, but the water that actually gets to LA would be partially.
Yeah, I mean, ideally there'd be some sort of wheeling through the aqueduct because that's the closest for capital costs. But there'd have to be some sort of exchange or.
Yeah. Did this estimate that you had then for the DW, Department of Water and Power source include that concept, or was it a brand new pipeline from California City up to this
for
area?
AVEC, it is a new pipeline from California
City. A new pipeline,
City.
okay. Thank you.
Quick question on, let's see, that's number 10, the mapping and potential recycled water projects.
Yes.
Does this setup include what already goes to the
No, this is just proposed new.
This is just proposed new, okay. Because I was just curious about places to go golfing. They're already receiving the recycled water, and that also feeds to each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And not to beat the dust issue too much here, but we've introduced a dust concern in this presentation that is a different dust concern than the playa dust. I'm not sure if we need to handle those differently. It occurs to me that the mitigation paths for dealing with dust sources, potential dust sources in the future would be completely different. So blending them together as a dust issue might be to our detriment in the future.
Don, if you had to estimate, maybe we talked about this already, but dust control, dust mitigation in areas that were once farmed, what do you think? An acre foot per acre? No? Half an acre foot per acre?
What's happened in other areas where land has been fallowed, and additional water that would have been farm irrigation water is employed for almost invariably for a limited amount of time to revegetate with either native or something close to it, so that ultimately
xeriscaping.
No additional water is required. But there would be a period of time where, especially with the really successive dry years that we've had here and all over the western U.S. for that matter, trying to revegetate in a more natural way can be almost unproductive. But giving the seedlings a little bit of water when they're small to get a root system going is what makes the most sense.
What do you think, Steve? Because it's going to be you in a water truck driving around.
I don't think water's our answer.
Well,
we have some alternatives. That's what we're going to look for.
Revegetating to native vegetation is inexpensive. And using a small amount of water out of the existing systems, if it's farmland we're talking about, doesn't require any new infrastructure either. It just means that when you transition, you don't destroy the existing irrigation system. Not directly.
Any other comments? Okay, for this one, we will go to the public. If you have comments or questions in regards to this item, come on up.
Judy Decker again. For your historical conservation, I think you should add the Simmons station that is available for agriculture and anybody doing any kind of irrigation to look up and find out the evaporation rates for the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, you don't have to run.
Sophia Merck. In regards to utilizing the waters under recycling, I would like for this group to look at not just Saracoso, but also look at the existing fairgrounds and the cemetery that doesn't require a lot of lift to utilize that water, and perhaps look at utilizing the recycled water in some of the vegetation that is on the islands that you see in Ridgecrest on the streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no other comments, back to the committee. Any other comments or questions in regards to this item 3C? Okay, Steve, we will move on to 3D, the GSP update.
Sure. Heather's gonna. We're gonna.
Well, goodness gracious, welcome back.
Surprise!
Again.
Heather's gonna do that.
Yeah.
It's pretty brief.
Yeah, there's no slides for this. Just to go over some of the documents that you have to, the model documentation. I don't believe we received very many comments on that, so I'm assuming those are still coming by TAC members. We did ask for that by today, so just a reminder to look at that. Section 2.
The date on that, sorry to interrupt, is the 17th, yes?
For Section 2.
Yes.
Model documentation we sent out a week and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, just reiterating, it is September 17th. The end of that day or the beginning of that day?
Yes, for Section 2, we, that just came out. We were requesting September 17th for comments back on that one. As was mentioned before, the transport modeling results, we should have that by next week, I would think. They're still just finalizing up the presentation of the results, so we'll certainly be sharing that with you and not wait for a TAC meeting to get you that data. And then the sustainable management criteria, this is critical as we're trying to get other GSP sections completed, so if you can get those comments in by next week, end of next week, that would be very helpful for us. And in terms of the general schedule, we're working with staff to update a schedule that will be given to the board next at the next board meeting. It could be that as we're moving forward with different sections, we'll give you just different portions of sections to review instead of waiting for a completed Section 4 or Section 5 to come out. But Section 5 will be projects and management actions. That's what we just went over. Those are the projects and management actions that we're intending to include, and include the description, the full description of all those as required by Sigma. They outline the requirements for the description. We are intending to have a complete internal draft by the end of October for all the sections of the GSP. So I'll give you a brief update on that. Like I said, by the board meeting, we'll have a more updated schedule, formal schedule to give you.
Yeah, at the board meeting.
Yes.
But one thing important, and I tend to talk out of turn, Heather's probably going to get mad at me, because I say things maybe I shouldn't. But one thing that's important to you guys, and I think for David tonight at the PAC too, is we're still on a plan that gives you folks and the PAC the entire draft GSP to review and comment on before we take it to the board.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. I think that's something you guys was always promised, and we're still planning to do that.
Yes.
That's it.
Question?
Okay, that's it. All right. Any questions or comments from the committee? So as you just stated, we can expect before we have our meeting in October, the October 3rd?
3rd.
Yeah.
Okay, and this will be kind of an entire draft for all of the GSP.
Before October 3rd?
No.
No, we'll have an internal draft by end of October.
By end of October.
Internal
the
means
entire,
us and maybe some of the authority staff, but primarily us, a complete draft that we can look at. Then we want to get it to the authority staff, legal counsel, to make sure we're not stepping out of line, anything legal.
Okay.
And the GMs, and then it would go to the TAC PAC and the public, and back to us with comments before it goes to the board.
Okay, gotcha.
And that board date is?
Right now, the board date is still January the 16th, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we are now moving on to item number 4, future agenda items for the October meeting. And you have an A, B, C, and D, and Steve, this is to you. Any changes to this? We have additional data gap status report, sustainable management criteria, GSP implementation, and of course, an update at that time.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. Probably the most important one at that point is going to be the GSP update on sections of the GSP and where we are. But yeah, it looks fine, and we'll work with you on any changes.
Okay. All right. Once again, our TAC meetings are set up for October 3rd, November 7th, and December 5th.
I have a question. The GSP update that you're talking about, Steve, will include a schedule for what's left of the tasks for you guys and for us. There's a schedule here you were talking about providing. When is that going to be available?
Oh, can you come up to
board
the
meeting in 2 weeks?
Okay.
That is at 2 weeks. Heather and I were talking about it on the way up, so yeah.
Thank you.
A fairly detailed schedule.
Okay.
That's a really good thing to do.
Yes.
A lot of us have been very concerned. Once the POAM kind of dropped off the edge, we're running in a kind of indeterminate way. You guys are working as hard as you can, but you still don't necessarily know if you're going to finish the race or not.
Yep.
But the schedule with some realistic input is a very important thing.
Yes, it is. Without long bottom, we're getting away with murder here.
I think it's multiple murders.
You realize that was just recorded on video.
I hope he heard it.
In the newspaper.
All right, so that was items 4 and 5 now done, and then to item 6. Water Resource Manager and also us as committee members. This is your time for any announcements or comments. I'll go to you first, Steve.
I'll just say thank you to Heather and Nicole for sure for doing a great job. So, yeah.
Okay. Members of the TAC, we'll start on this side, and I'll go to you, Earl. First again.
I'm done.
Nothing for you, Don? And you, Don, now?
I would like to thank Stetson engineers and staff again for the really hard, conscientious work that they're doing for this basin. Even though we beat up on you at times, it's all in the spirit of trying to, get us to where we need to be. And I don't feel very good about pounding on you guys, but you're doing a great job. I think any encouragement we can offer to the board to resolve the very difficult areas that are there is a good thing to do too.
Thank you, Don. I have no comments on my side, but I did want to mention Michelle Anderson is busy out in the field, out in Central Valley. That's why she was not able to come to the meeting. Tim Parker is also away for business items, all groundwater related. And Stefan Bork is getting some very much needed time off for a bit before he comes back into the needs of the Navy. So, all right, over to you, Eddie.
Yeah, just I guess one comment, kind of echoing what I think Tim Parker had mentioned in some of his comments, and then Don had mentioned, Don Decker, especially as we kind of move forward on some of these model scenarios, maybe having a little more narrative. I know you guys are under a huge sort of time constraint, but maybe just some of the details on which water district wells are going offline, which other wells are going online, just so that'll help us sort of better understand the hydrographs that we're seeing. I mean, a page of text is better than, nothing, but it's just something we can sort of, chew on a little bit. I would appreciate it, so.
Thank you, Eddie. Wade?
No comments.
Go ahead. Your turn.
I can't resist, even though I've already had my chance today. Again, yeah, I'll second Don's comments. Thank you,
By the way,
ladies.
Mallory, I did mark you that you were here.
Oh,
today.
good. Awesome. Thank you for your work, and hope you like my dust mitigation strategy, that little bottle I brought you while you were talking. I could hear the dust was getting to you. This is not related to TAC business, but I thought I would just offer, I've been approached since several of my colleagues and friends in the Valley know that I'm still trying to be active or becoming more active in the issues regarding water. And I've been approached more than once with the question, what the hell is a water extraction facility? I mean, we talked at the last PAC about making the language of this call to the public for insights into their wells. I think Laura Lee pointed out we need to make this simple, and we just made it a lot worse. I'm not sure people are going to recognize that they have a water extraction facility if they've got one, but that's not our topic and issue. But just for general awareness, I don't know if others are.
Hand them a plastic straw.
Thank you, Mallory, for bringing that up again. The idea of a simplified well registration form seems to be somehow lost in the ether. If Stetson digs out the one that the well owners put together, it actually has information that's requested that you would like to have. Mm-hmm. And if you read the thing you just gave here, it's missing that information. Right. It is actually incomplete. I don't understand where and why we're battling this around, especially for the domestic non-de minimis well owners, where we're not requesting meter brands and model numbers and serial numbers and this, that, and the other thing. It's really pretty simple.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. If we are all set and ready to go, I need a motion.
Motion.
Okay.
Second.
And second. All right. We're all set. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll go ahead and finish our meeting at 3:48.
Woo-hoo.
You're welcome.
I know. I can see their marks on.